Well, ladies and gentlemen, it finally happened. Mary Jane Watson has broken up with Paul. For those who don't know, and I cannot imagine if you are in the comic book space that you don't know what this is, Paul is an infamous character who has been appearing in comic books for some years now. He's a character that after Mary Jane Watson and Peter Parker were finally back together after their marriage had been broken up by a deal with the devil in the worst Spider-Man comic ever written, after they had been finally put back together by Nick Spencer, and it seemed that they were finally patching up that storyline, they introduced this new character, Paul, that she had a relationship with, and it's essentially been used to torture Spider-Man fans for years now. Whenever you want Peter and MJ to have a moment together, Paul is there. Whenever you think Peter Parker and MJ might have a chance to get together, Paul gets in the way of it, and Mary Jane affirms her connection to Paul. Whenever you think that Peter Parker might find out that there's something wrong with Paul, that he might turn out to be evil, that will make Mary Jane stay away from him, they pull the rug out from under your feet. They prove that Mary Jane Watson will not leave Paul, and that the Spider-Man Mary Jane relationship is dead in comics. And it's been years of this. They made Mary Jane toxic to Peter. They mischaracterized Mary Jane. They also made it so that her every decision had to do with Paul. So it's essentially been years of this torture of taking a character you know you want to be with the hero and putting her with someone else and constantly taunting the fans with that, even as the fans demand Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson to get back together. But all bad things have to come to an end eventually. And so we finally see Mary Jane breaking up with Paul, telling him that it's just not working out. And it looks like Marvel Comics themselves knows what a big deal this is going to be for fans. When Mary Jane says, "I'm breaking up with you, Paul," an ethereal heavenly light comes in from behind them. Like the heavens opened up when this happened. They knew what a big moment that this was going to be. So it appears after years of seeing this disgusting glasses-faced, man-bun-face Grace Comics and be the punching bag for everyone in and around comics, we're finally done with it. But there's just one problem. A lot of people do not think that this is going to fix what happened with Peter Parker and Mary Jane. A lot of people have said they do not think that this means that they're gonna get Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson back together. And meanwhile, I saw a lot of unfortunate comments saying that even if they were to get Peter Parker and Mary Jane together after all of this, that it wouldn't matter to them. I'm seeing some people say that they don't want to see Peter and MJ together anymore, that the relationship has been tainted for good, that Mary Jane's character, after all the toxicity and mischaracterization, has been tainted for good, and that they completely destroyed this relationship, and there's no way to repair it. Now, I completely understand people being wary of Marvel Comics after they just spent literally years pulling the rug out from under people's feet. In fact, they've pretty much been doing that since Spider-Man One More Day happened. It's just that with the Paul stuff, it's probably the worst it's ever been since One More Day. So I don't blame people at all for being wary and not wanting to get their hopes up, and I think that that is a smart thing to do. I also don't really trust this company. I also can see the possibility of, after Ultimate Spider-Man ending, them trying to do something where Peter and MJ get back together as a little sales boost. We'll see, but I want to specifically address the people out there who think that the Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson relationship is destroyed for good, and that Mary Jane Watson herself has been destroyed for good after everything that's happened, after everything that happened with One More Day, with them making a deal with the devil to break up their marriage, after all the false leads and leading the fans on and pulling the rug out from under their feet, after getting them back together in the Nick Spencer run, and then all of the stuff that happened with Paul and all of the mischaracterizations and all the ways that they made Mary Jane come off as toxic to Peter. People say that it cannot be repaired. But I'm just wanting to tell you all right now, as much as I commend people for being wary about Marvel Comics' future, if you're saying that there is no way to repair this couple, then you don't know comic book relationships. And in this video, I finally get the chance to talk about my favorite comic book relationship and use them as an example of how these things are a cycle and how, generally speaking, no comic book relationship is too far gone. This is not the first time I have seen people look at an iconic comic book relationship and say that they never want to see them together again and that it's impossible to fix them. The relationship I'm going to use an example and tie it back to Peter Parker and Mary Jane and how their relationship can be fixed to the point where you probably won't even notice all the bad stuff done with Paul apart from video essays remembering it. The relationship I'm going to use as an example is Gambit and Rogue. Now, let me explain. Gambit and Rogue are two X-Men characters, and they are currently a married couple in the main Uncanny X-Men comic, which is the top-selling X-Men comic of the time right now. They've been married since 2018, still going strong, and I've seen them on a lot of people's lists these days of top comic book relationships, most healthy comic book relationships, favorite comic book relationships. They're getting a lot more media. They had an appearance in X-Men 97 that was very heart-wrenching, and you know I did not agree what they did with Rogue's character in that show. But it really seems that that show might have actually done more to make them more popular, even though I disagreed with how things were handled in that show. And it has been leaked that they are going to have an appearance as what appears to be a package deal in the Marvel Rivals game probably later this year, where they were also going to appear as an engaged couple, not to mention all the new merchandise that's coming out with them recently. So it seems that Gambit and Rogue, while they might have not have gotten enough exposure to be mainstream yet, they are a very iconic and popular comic book couple. And right now, it seems that they're kind of a package deal, appearing in all of this stuff together. But it was not always this way. Would you believe that there was a time that I lived through and that I remember vividly that people said that Gambit and Rogue were the most toxic couple and that they never wanted to see them together again and that their relationship could never be fixed, much in the same way that people are saying about Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson right now? Let me explain to you the history. So I guess while as we get into this, I should probably explain who Gambit and Rogue were in the 90s and why they were so popular in the first place. Gambit and Rogue were two of the most popular characters from Marvel Comics in the 90s. According to a 1994 poll, they ranked just below Wolverine and Spider-Man. Their relationship began as a series of comedic scenes where Gambit, who was portrayed as this womanizing character, relentlessly pursued Rogue, who couldn't touch people without absorbing their powers and their psyche. So there were just a bunch of funny scenes of Gambit trying to tempt Rogue, Rogue being tempted, and then having to rebuff him with her immense strength. Fans responded very enthusiastically to these scenes and the idea of the relationship, and therefore it grew from there. Infamously, it appeared in the 90s cartoons with scenes that were very much inspired by those flirty scenes from the comic. But the thing is, if you've only seen the cartoon, you've only seen their relationship go that far. In the 90s, Gambit and Rogue became a full-blown relationship where they actually dealt with their drama and actually made some progression and development. So let's explain exactly why these two were popular. Well, once again, you had the mysterious womanizer hitting on and pursuing the girl who couldn't be touched. Essentially, it was very hot. The chemistry between these two characters was just off the charts, just dripping with constant romantic tension that would seemingly never be able to be resolved. But as the relationship went further, there was much more substance added to it. Once again, their scenes together were so fun, it evolved, and the fans loved it so much that the writers capitalized on it, and they began to add development to it. There is just some great relationship drama and character development between Gambit and Rogue in the early 90s. I would really recommend, if you want to read anything about these two, please check out the comics with them from the early 90s. While it would seem that the biggest obstacle with Gambit and Rogue's relationship was the fact that they couldn't touch it, actually, really, if you want to get down to it, reading these early comics, it came down to trust. Gambit was portrayed as a character who didn't want to reveal a lot of his past. Rogue was a character that was historically closed off and didn't feel like she could trust anyone. And ultimately, the biggest problem in their relationship was Rogue really didn't believe that he actually loved her. She thought that she was just another object for him to charge up and throw away, as she put it. But this also created a really big draw in their relationship, because as Gambit's character became more developed in comics, we got to see that he actually really was as devoted as he said he would be, which created an interesting subversion of this character. He's the ultimate womanizing, charming ladies man, but he only really loves one one girl. He's the guy who everyone thinks is a liar, but he's secretly the most devoted guy on the planet. So once again, this relationship was extremely popular in the 90s, and you can tell based on the letters pages that you read if you have comics back from there, the covers, and the amount of focus given to these characters during that era. So now I've established that they were popular, but what would happen to their relationship in the future? Well, unfortunately, it took a hit based on the same time comics took a hit in the late 90s. Editorial was a mess at the time, and so Gambit and Rogue, by extension, got worse and worse writing. They were still trying to milk these two people as the most doomed relationship in comics, and comic books started to milk the drama a bit too much. But it's fine to have drama if it's well written, but this became frustrating drama because editorial wasn't there making sure that the stories actually were well written or even had endpoints. For example, very famously in the late 90s, there's a story that ends with Rogue seemingly leaving Gambit in Antarctica to die after a conflict. Now, here's the thing, and here's what people don't know who haven't read the story. It wasn't supposed to actually be Rogue leaving Gambit there. It was supposed to be Rogue has absorbed Gambit's personality that had a lot of self-hatred within it, and that she essentially left him there because that other personality told her to. But because editorial wasn't there at the time, they did not explain it well, and it just came off as her leaving him there. And this point, this very, very dramatic point in their relationship, was never properly resolved at that point in comics. I am trying to give you the simplified version of all of this. It gets very complicated. But anyway, that is an example that in the late 90s, Gambit and Rogue's relationship became less well written and more milked for drama for all that it was worth. But they still went on with a strong fan base. And after that, in the early 2000s, they returned to that original flirtatious and fun energy that made them popular in the first place in the Extreme X-Men run, which is not very popular, but it does have some of the best Gambit and Rogue chemistry and personality writing that I've read from their relationship, including a very infamous storyline where Rogue literally goes into the afterlife to bring Gambit back from the dead. I think what really made this relationship popular, and what still does to this day, is it's very much like a fairy tale-like relationship, so it continued to be very, very popular with fans and prominent in comics, even though it did not get the attention in the movies as it probably should have. They were still a top-tier comic book relationship, but then here's where things went downhill and went all the way down south. When Joe Quesada took over Marvel Comics, he's the guy who broke up Peter and MJ, but he pretty much broke up nearly all the iconic relationships in comics. Scott and Jean broke up. They intended to have Reed and Sue break up, but they didn't go through with that plan. But eventually, it would be Gambit and Rogue's turn. Now, the nuking of Gambit and Rogue's relationship in the late 2000s started with a writer named Peter Milligan. Peter Milligan wrote this incredibly out-of-character and terrible storyline that is now referred to as the Bizarre Love Triangle. And if you want to read anything about these characters, I would recommend please do not read this story. I am worse off for having read it, and I wish that I didn't, but at least I can make this video off of it. Essentially, Gambit was entirely mischaracterized. In this storyline, he was all of a sudden written as someone who was super bitter and angry about his and Rogue's inability to touch, which doesn't make any sense because, first of all, he was never written as upset with that or having any problem with that in the past, but also, up to this point, that aspect of Gambit and Rogue's relationship wasn't even prominent anymore. There had been several times in comics recently up to that point where Rogue either didn't have her powers or he was able to touch her through an enhancement of his powers, so it was really weird and out of character for this to all of a sudden come up with it. But in this story, he's just super bitter and angry about his inability to be physical with Rogue. But in this story, what happens is as Gambit is frustrated about this aspect of his life, Mystique, Rogue's adopted mother, Mystique, comes in, disguises herself as a student at the school, and tries to seduce Gambit. And he ultimately rebuffs her, but this was Rogue's mom trying to sleep with her boyfriend for Rogue's own good, as Mystique put it, so that Rogue would see how awful Gambit is and break up with him. Yes, this storyline existed. I gotta tell you guys, this storyline is so bizarre. Every character in this storyline was written out of character. Everyone was in the story was either uncharacteristically angry or mean-spirited. It made no sense. Anyway, it ends up where Rogue gets angry at Gambit for not telling him about Mystique, even though he did reject her, but it ends up in a ton of argumentation that winds up with Gambit becoming Death. It's really confusing, but it was a really terrible storyline that highly mischaracterized both characters and their relationship, and is just known henceforth as the bizarre love triangle arc. And has it been retconned? Sort of. It's only brought up as a joke in comics these days because it was so bizarre and so obviously out of character that no one accepted it as canon for the characters. But it was a great nuking of their relationship. But hey, everyone recognized that it wasn't in character for anyone involved, so it was thought that they could move away from this bad characterization and get the characters back to normal. But then would come what happened with Mike Carey's run, and Mike Carey brought Gambit back and characterized him again correctly as someone who did truly love Rogue, and who was very devoted to her. But Mike Carey also mischaracterized Gambit as a bit too devoted to Rogue, because in this storyline, Rogue finally for the first time had control of her powers, so it would seem that she and Gambit could patch things up, whatever was going on in the past, and move forward from there. Now the most seemingly infamous obstacle to their relationship was gone, right? Well, no. Mike Carey had other plans. I'm giving you guys the short version of this story, but essentially, Mike Carey, he wanted Rogue to be with his personal favorite character, Magneto. So what happened next? There was a lot more mischaracterization. Now, let me tell you, up to this point in comics, Rogue, even through the bizarre love triangle storyline, was consistently written as madly in love with Gambit. Love at first sight. They even lived together during the Extreme X-Men for a very long time. They did try to make it so that she had some sort of interest in Magneto in the 90s, but it had been forgotten. It was an idea that never got off the ground. But here, after 10 years, it was all of a sudden being brought up again, and Rogue was uncharacteristically made to be standoffish of Gambit and not wanting to discuss anything with him. And Gambit was uncharacteristically written as fine with it. He even tells her at one point to go off and play the field and figure herself out. What ends up happening is after Gambit gives a big speech about his devotion and that he is Rogue's endgame essentially, Rogue leaves and just winds up hooking up with Magneto in the next issue. This was a huge moment of character assassination, and I remember how much hate this storyline was getting, mainly directed at Rogue as a character. Because after all this time, after all that she and Gambit had been through, after even getting control of her powers, she essentially ghosted Gambit for a while, didn't want to talk to him, and hooked up with Magneto. But Gambit, on the other hand, was just written as a character who was just fine with it for some reason. What was actually happening in the meta is Mike Carey just wanted Rogue to get with Magneto, but the fans weren't having it. So shortly after this storyline, the Magneto and Rogue relationship ended as quickly as it started, and writers tried to move on, but the damage was done. At this point, I remember so much hate being directed at Rogue, and I remember people saying that they never wanted to see Gambit and Rogue be together again, because at this point, they thought that their relationship had too much damage done to it. But it wasn't even done then. Later, in 2012, Gambit got a solo series, and it's actually a pretty good solo series, but the writer attempted to give him some of his agency back after the mischaracterization from Mike Carey. And in this series, Rogue literally catches him with someone else and gets upset with him for it, and they get into another argument. And after that girl dies, like an issue later, Rogue tries to patch things up with him and even offers him a place on the Avengers, where she is on, and it makes it seem like she's trying to patch their relationship up. But what happens after this is, as Rogue is recommending Gambit to the Avengers, she writes an assessment of him saying that they will never be able to fully trust him, which really hurts Gambit to his core. So after everything, this was just another time of tearing down their relationship and making it seem toxic and volatile and mischaracterizing the characters. Once again, after this, I saw it pretty common for people on comic book forums to say that they did not want to see these characters together anymore because they felt there was too much drama. They were tired of being led on by Marvel Comics, and they felt that these characters could never be repaired. What had made these relationships good was ruined for them. And after that, there was a big lull period where Gambit and Rogue barely appeared together in comics at all, and they even did some bait and switches, making it seem like they were going to appear in comics, only for them not to. At this point, while the relationship was still iconic to comic book fans, if you were currently reading comics, they were not popular. I remember them even appearing on top 10 most toxic and dysfunctional relationships list after all of this. But it was not over for this relationship yet, because after everything that these characters had been through, there were still some fans of this relationship who still believed in it pulling through in the end. And the fact that there were those vocal fans still might have led to Marvel finally relenting and giving the characters a miniseries that was going to be written by Kelly Thompson. Now, Marvel Comics did not originally intend for this comic to end with the characters getting back together, but the first person we have to thank for getting Gambit and Rogue back together is Kelly Thompson, who took a look at these characters and almost single-handedly repaired their relationship from all the damage. What basically happened is what was originally just going to be a silly, fun miniseries, probably throwaway, was changed when Kelly Thompson went back and read through all of the Gambit and Rogue comics and all of their relationship history, saw that Marvel Comics was only ever doing the same thing with them, and wanted to do something different with them with this miniseries. So she essentially looked back through all of the drama that Marvel Comics had put them through and wanted to repair all of that. And she actually succeeded. What Kelly Thompson did in the Rogue Gambit 2018 miniseries is she took the characters and she wrote them with that original chemistry that made them so popular in the first place. She wrote them very close to their 90s counterparts, but made sure to evolve the characters a bit. Basically, after years of mischaracterization with this relationship between these two characters, basically all of the chemistry and all of the charisma and all of the heat that made the characters fun came back. But Kelly Thompson did even more than that. In this story, she put forth the premise they were undercover as a couple seeking relationship therapy with a character that steals memories. And not to convolute you with all the details in the story, but essentially this storyline forced them to confront all the problems of the relationship in the past. And Kelly Thompson found a way to address all of it. She finally made them address what happened with the Antarctica storyline. With other things she was careful about, Kelly Thompson said she didn't believe that canon should just be ignored even if people hate it. But once again, the awful storyline with Mystique basically got a jokey mention that didn't directly address it. She did give an explanation for what went on with Magneto, but she didn't directly refer to exactly what it was or refer to Magneto. So the retconning and explanation is there if you want it, but you can also just forget what happened with Magneto because it doesn't directly address it. And she addressed that whole thing about Rogue saying that you would never be able to trust Gambit and actually made a character moment to repair their relationship. So essentially, this little 5-issue miniseries was a miracle worker in repairing all of the terrible things that they had done with Gambit and Rogue throughout the years and rediscovering the original chemistry that they once had. And it worked. Now, Kelly Thompson did not have complete control over this relationship, so she couldn't judge if it was going to end with them officially getting back together again. So what happened, and this is the craziest part, is Marvel Comics was trying to compete with the Batman and Catwoman marriage that never was, that's another video, in comics. And they were going to have Kitty Pryde and Colossus get married. But at the last minute, I think it was Danny Lore said at a Marvel Comics conference, he said, hey, why don't we just make it be Gambit and Rogue instead? And based on just that meant that Kelly Thompson could end her series with them getting back together. And about a month later in comics, the characters were married. So in literally less than a year's time, the characters went from two characters who were a dormant relationship that so many people were saying that they never wanted to even see together again to back together and married within less than a year. Unfortunately, we find out later that the reason why Marvel Comics let them go through with the marriage is somebody said that they could promise them that they could eventually get divorced, which just goes to show how Marvel Comics feels about marriage. But luckily, that isn't what happened. In the coming years, Gambit and Rogue unfortunately would not get a lot of focus as characters, even though they did get their own miniseries exploring them as a married couple. But what happened is that this marriage really stuck. They were finally free from the years of milking them for all of the drama and allowed to actually grow as characters. They were allowed to actually be supportive of each other and grow past a lot of the mistrust and lack of communication that had hindered their relationship in the past. And that's how through the years, up to this this point, the status of their relationship grew. And that's how you have so many people right now who are saying that they're their favorite comic book couple, or who can't see one without the other, or think that they're the most healthy relationship in comics, one of the best examples of a couple that isn't codependent but actually grows together. And that's how we get to this current point where they are once again one of the most iconic relationships in comics. They get merged together, they usually appear together, and while I don't trust it enough to think that Marvel Comics will never attack their relationship, it just really goes to show how far a relationship can come. Once again, they were about as destroyed as Mary Jane Watson and Peter Parker at one point. So the lesson from all of this, going back to Mary Jane Watson and Peter Parker, is no relationship is too far gone. Also, for the people blaming Mary Jane for what has happened in Spider-Man comics and hating the character, characters aren't people, they're characters. They're the result of what a writer chooses to write. And as we see with Gambit and Rogue, whether you've destroyed their relationship and made them toxic or made them this great relationship with great chemistry, that's up to the writer. And people's opinion on relationships are all just going to be judged by the kind of material that's being released at whatever point. Stories are stories, and the bad ones of the past don't need to be remembered. These are comics. You can even retcon one more day if you want. And it tends to be the most loved and iconic versions of these characters that last and that people think about. So no, Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson are not too far gone as a couple. No comic book couple is. These are all just the results of whatever decisions editorial is making for current canon at the time. Also, you guys, Mary Jane and Peter Parker are just too iconic. It's just the mainstream Amazing Spider-Man run that had broken them apart. In everything else, Spider-Man No Way Home, the Spider-Verse movies, the Insomniac games, everything, even the Ultimate Spider-Man universe affirmed how important Mary Jane Watson is to Peter Parker. So I understand people being cautiously optimistic, but I also want to point out things can change very quickly, and it's not always the worst result that happens. It's never too late for anyone's favorite comic book couple. But that's all I got for you guys today. What do you think of all of this, and what do you think about this comic book deep dive? Do you believe that Spider-Man and Mary Jane can ever be repaired in mainstream Spider-Man comics? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to support me, please consider becoming a patron or a member, and I will see you guys next time.